I never thought moving my wife into our dream home would start with the words, "Your wife is trespassing, and I'm calling the police right now." But that's exactly what Carol Whitmore, our HOA president, screamed across our driveway at 6 o'clock in the morning before Rachel had even finished unpacking her first box. She stood there in her robe, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. At first, I thought it had to be a misunderstanding. How could anyone call 911 on a homeowner for parking in their own driveway? But Carol wasn't just anyone. She was a woman whose world had collapsed years ago, and she had made it her mission to tear down anyone whose life looked even remotely happy. I didn't know it yet, but Rachel and I had just stepped into a war we hadn't asked for, and Carol was the kind of enemy who didn't stop until you were broken. It was still early, the sun barely rising over Westbrook Estates, when Rachel stepped out to grab something from her car. We'd moved her in the night before, a quiet celebration between the two of us. I was still in my pajama pants, sipping coffee, when I heard Carol's voice slice through the morning air. "Your wife is trespassing," she shouted, marching toward us with a pace that was almost military. "This is an HOA violation, and I'm calling the police." Rachel froze, a takeout coffee in one hand, car keys in the other. "I'm sorry? This is our house," she said, her voice calm but confused. Carol's eyes narrowed. "Not according to our records. And parking an unauthorized vehicle overnight is a $200 fine." She slapped a bright orange violation slip under Rachel's windshield wiper like she'd been waiting all night to do it. I stepped forward, holding out the paperwork that proved Rachel was not only my wife, but also a legal co-owner of the property, marriage certificate, property deed. Both signed, notarized, undeniable. Carol didn't even glance at them. "Rules are rules," she said flatly. "Some people need to learn their place." Then, without breaking eye contact, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right there in our driveway. My coffee went cold in my hand as I listened to her tell the dispatcher she had an intruder refusing to leave the premises. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Rachel, on the other hand, reacted like she was back in the ICU handling a medical emergency. Without a word, she pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and began recording. She captured Carol, ignoring our legal documents, the absurd violation, even the full 911 call. When she finally stepped back beside me, she whispered, "Jack, something's really wrong with this woman. We're going to need evidence of everything she does." By the time Officer Miguel Alvarez arrived, I still held on to a shred of hope that the madness would end. He looked over our documents, confirmed Rachel's right to be there, and gave Carol a warning about filing false reports. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "making false emergency calls is a serious offense. I suggest you think carefully before dialing 911 again." Carol's response wasn't relief or embarrassment. It was a slow, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I understand now," she said softly. "Rules. I'll remember that." It didn't sound like surrender. It sounded like a promise. That evening, Rachel found something that sent a shiver through both of us. While sorting through the mail, she discovered an anonymous letter addressed to concerned neighbors, complaining about people who don't understand community standards and inappropriate changes to the neighborhood. The handwriting was identical to the one on her $200 violation slip. Carol had been planning this before Rachel even moved in. Watching, waiting, lining up her first strike like a sniper, sighting a target. We sat on the porch that night, the warm summer air doing nothing to settle the unease in my chest. Rachel tried to joke about it, about how she'd faced families screaming in grief at the hospital and never once had anyone call the cops because she saved their child. We laughed, but there was a tightness in her smile. I glanced at the glowing windows across the street where Carol lived, curtains slightly parted, a shadow shifting inside, always watching. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the opening volley. Carol wasn't the kind of neighbor who knocked on your door to welcome you with cookies. She was the kind who built a file on you before you even moved in. And Rachel, strong, brilliant, and unafraid, had just become her new favorite target. And as I'd soon learn, Carol's attacks wouldn't just be about parking violations or HOA rules. They'd be about something much darker and far more dangerous. If you really want to understand the nightmare Rachel and I were about to live through, you have to understand Carol Whitmore. People don't wake up one morning and decide to declare war on their neighbors, not without a long, ugly history pushing them there. Carol wasn't always the icy-eyed tyrant peering at us from behind lace curtains. Once upon a time, she was Miss Whitmore, the beloved elementary school teacher whose second graders made her macaroni art and begged their parents to invite her to birthday parties. She had a gentle laugh back then, or so I've heard from neighbors who've lived here long enough. Her life looked picture perfect. A respectable husband named Dennis, a comfortable colonial-style home, summers in Maine, and the unshakable security of someone who believed her world was stable. But stability has a funny way of cracking when you least expect it. In 2012, Dennis left her. Not for a fling, not for a passing infatuation, but for a woman 20 years younger, someone Carol bitterly referred to as the gold digger for years afterward. The divorce was ugly. Carol fought for every stick of furniture, every photo album, every scrap of dignity she could salvage. She lost more than she won. Still, she held on to the house. That was her fortress, her proof to herself that she hadn't lost everything. Then, in late 2020, the final blow landed. Dennis died in a car accident on I-95, less than 2 miles from the lake house he now shared with his new wife. That woman, the younger, prettier one Carol despised, inherited everything. Life insurance, retirement accounts. The lake house. Carol got nothing. No money, no keepsakes, not even a formal letter of closure. Just a phone call from an attorney and the knowledge that Dennis had erased her from his life entirely, even in death. From that moment on, Carol seemed to harden into stone. She withdrew from old friends, stopped going to church. The only thing she poured herself into was the Homeowners Association, first as treasurer, then as president. Neighbors say she campaigned like a politician running for office, promising to restore community standards and protect the neighborhood's character. It didn't take long to see what that actually meant. Carol's definition of character was frozen in the year 1995. Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, quiet streets where everyone looked like they belonged in the same yearbook. When new families moved in, especially young couples, immigrants, or anyone who didn't fit her narrow image, she watched them like a hawk. Looking back now, it's clear she wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was enforcing her own vision of who was worthy to live here. I've since pieced together bits of her private life from whispers and public records. The day after Dennis's funeral, she withdrew almost all her savings and paid off her mortgage. Then she poured thousands into installing surveillance cameras around her property, not just on the exterior, but aimed at the street and neighboring houses. One neighbor told me she caught Carol jotting down the license plates of visitors. Another swore Carol asked intrusive questions about how much they made and what kind of people they had over for dinner. There's also the part nobody talks about unless they lower their voice. Carol targeted happy couples the way a hunter tracks game. She'd find the smallest infraction and magnify it until it became a legal ordeal. Families would either comply with her every demand or pack up and leave. Her vendetta wasn't random. It was a twisted form of control. In her mind, she'd lost her marriage, her financial security, her identity, so if she couldn't have those things, she would make damn sure no one else enjoyed them either. By the time Rachel moved in, Carol had been in power for over a decade. She knew every loophole in HOA bylaws, every sympathetic ear in City Hall, and every bureaucratic lever she could pull to make life miserable for the people she set her sights on. And as fate would have it, we had just become her newest target, a youngish, happy, mixed heritage couple, daring to live in her neighborhood. If I'd known her history that first morning, maybe I would have seen the danger in her smile. Maybe I would have understood that we weren't just dealing with a petty neighbor enforcing parking rules. We were standing in the crosshairs of a woman who'd built her entire second life around punishing people like us. And Carol Whitmore never, ever missed her shot. Carol didn't waste a single day making her presence known. It wasn't even 24 hours after the trespassing fiasco that she struck again, this time with all the precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment over and over in her mind. The morning after Rachel moved in, I woke to the sound of something slipping under our front door. Not mail, not a flyer. A single sheet of thick paper folded in half. On it, in Carol's neat looping handwriting, was an official HOA violation notice for $200. Reason: unauthorized overnight parking and presence of unregistered vehicle. She didn't even bother with a knock or a conversation. Just a silent, bureaucratic dagger slid into our home before breakfast. Rachel was still in her scrubs from the night shift when she found it. She stared at the paper for a long moment, then looked at me with that tired, slightly incredulous expression I'd seen on her after a long night in the ICU. "She's serious about this," she said quietly. I stepped outside to get some air, and there she was. Carol, standing across the street with her clipboard, pretending to inspect a neighbor's flower bed, but very clearly watching our door. The moment she saw me, she turned and started toward us with that brisk, no-nonsense gait. "Mr. Harris," she began, voice syrupy but tight, "I trust you've received the notice. O rules are very clear. Unregistered vehicles cannot be parked overnight." "It's my wife's car," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "She lives here. This is her home." Carol tilted her head, eyes scanning me like I was an unruly student in her old classroom. "I'm afraid the HOA records don't reflect that. Until we have proper registration, you'll be fined for each infraction. Daily." I held up the marriage certificate and property deed, the same ones Officer Alvarez had seen. "These are proper registration." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Rules are rules, Mr. Harris. Paperwork must be submitted to the HOA board for approval. And—" She let the pause hang in the air just long enough to make my skin prickle. "Some people need to learn their place before they can be part of a community." Rachel, who had stepped out behind me, pulled her phone from her pocket and began recording again. "Could you repeat that last part for the record, Carol?" Carol didn't flinch. She glanced at the phone lens, then smiled slow, deliberate, without warmth. "Of course. Rules are rules." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon she couldn't wait to use again. That afternoon, we found the next blow. While Rachel was taking out the trash, she noticed a fluorescent green sticker plastered across her windshield. Another violation, this one for obstructing sidewalk visibility. Our driveway didn't even touch the sidewalk. Then came the letter. Not from the HOA, but from a concerned neighbor, slipped into our mailbox without postage. It spoke of the importance of maintaining our neighborhood's traditional values and avoiding unnecessary changes that could disrupt community harmony. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same precise loops and sharp slants as Carol's violation notice. She had planned this. She'd been watching us long before Rachel moved in. And now that we were here, she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was building a paper trail, a false record of misconduct. That night, Rachel and I sat at our kitchen table, our dinner growing cold as we went through the notices and letters. "This isn't about parking," Rachel said finally. "This is about me, about us." I nodded, the weight of it settling in my chest. We were up against someone who had made an art form out of harassment, and judging by the look on her face that morning, she was just getting started. From across the street, through the narrow gap in her curtains, I saw a flicker of movement. Carol, standing in her darkened living room, watching our house like it was the evening news. Clipboard ready. The so-called welcome was over. The siege had begun. If I had to name the opening stage of Carol's campaign against us, I'd call it the testing boundaries phase, though psychological warfare light might be more accurate. She didn't come at us with one big blow. She chipped away, day by day, until the sound of footsteps outside our window at dawn made my stomach knot. Week 1 was a barrage of petty violations, each one more absurd than the last. On Monday, we were fined because our mailbox was 2 inches higher than HOA standard. On Tuesday, Rachel's welcome mat, a simple woven rug her grandmother had given her, was not in an approved community color. Wednesday, she claimed Rachel had created excessive noise by closing her car door at 6:30 a.m. when leaving for her hospital shift. Thursday, a violation for trash cans visible from the street, which had been in the exact same place for the previous 3 years without issue. By Friday, we'd racked up over $800 in bogus fines. Each time, Carol appeared within minutes of whatever offense she'd documented, as if she'd been crouched behind her curtains with a stopwatch. It wasn't about the rules. It was about control. Week 2 turned sinister. The violations didn't stop, but they were joined by something far more dangerous: anonymous phone calls to the hospital where Rachel worked. They claimed she'd been unprofessional with grieving families, that she was emotionally unstable due to domestic stress. In healthcare, even an unfounded complaint can shadow a career. Rachel's supervisor called her into the office. "I don't believe these for a second," he said, "but policy requires we investigate." I watched her come home that night, shoulders slumped, eyes distant, as if part of her light had been dimmed. "Jack," she whispered, "what if she ruins my name at the hospital? 15 years? Gone?" I didn't have an answer. To make it worse, Carol filed a zoning complaint with the city, claiming our house had illegal modifications. We hadn't touched a single wall since moving in. But her background as a former county assessor meant she knew exactly which bureaucratic strings to pull. Soon, we were dealing with city inspectors demanding surveys and permits, each costing hundreds to prove our innocence. Week 3 was when she went nuclear. A complaint to the state medical licensing board accused Rachel of improperly removing medical equipment from the hospital and exercising unsafe judgment in patient care. The day Rachel got the call, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor, surrounded by legal documents and violation slips. She wasn't crying quietly, she was shaking, sobbing, her hands pressed to her temples. "I could lose my nursing license over lies," she said. "This is who I am, Jack. This is my life." Seeing her like that, the same woman who held dying children's hands, who'd worked through nights that would break most people, it twisted something deep inside me. I realized we were no longer just protecting our home. We were protecting her identity. The worst part? Every official channel failed us. The police called it a civil matter. Our lawyer reminded us that as HOA president, Carol technically had the authority to issue fines and enforce standards. The medical board had to investigate any complaint, no matter how malicious. And the city wasn't going to waive inspection fees just because the accusations were false. Carol had turned the system into her weapon, and we were the targets. That Friday night, Rachel sat across from me, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. "If the system won't protect us," she said slowly, "then we protect ourselves. We start documenting everything. Every word, every action. We find out what she's hiding." There was no tremor in her voice now, only resolve. The war had stopped being one-sided. By the time the 3rd week ended, Rachel and I had learned a bitter truth. Carol wasn't going to stop until she either broke us or drove us out. Every channel we trusted had failed. The law didn't care. The HOA bylaws were stacked in her favor. And the medical board's investigation was a noose dangling over Rachel's career. That's when something in both of us shifted. We stopped thinking like victims waiting for rescue. We started thinking like people who were going to build our own rescue and maybe take the fight straight to her doorstep. It began with a single, quiet sentence from Rachel one Friday night, as we sat surrounded by piles of violation slips, certified letters, and city inspection notices. "If the system won't protect us," she said, "then we protect ourselves. We find out what she's hiding." I'd seen that look on her before in the ICU, when a child's vitals dropped and she had seconds to act. Calm, sharp, unblinking. We decided to treat Carol the way Rachel treated a complex medical case. Observe, document, analyze. She set up a binder with color-coded tabs, one for each type of harassment: HOA fines, anonymous complaints, city filings, medical board accusations. Every document was labeled with the exact time and date we received it. But we needed more than our own records. We needed someone who knew how to dig deeper. That someone turned out to be Frank Miller. Frank lived 4 houses down, a quiet guy in his late 50s who mostly kept to himself. I knew he'd worked in law enforcement, but I didn't realize until he knocked on our door one evening that he'd been an NYPD detective for 20 years. He'd been watching Carol for months, ever since she'd tried to slap him with a fine for unapproved fencing that didn't exist. "I've seen people like her before," Frank said, leaning against our kitchen counter. "They hide behind rules, but it's all about control. And control always leaves a paper trail." Frank taught us how to conduct our own investigation without crossing legal lines. We learned how to approach neighbors for information without tipping Carol off, how to request public records under the state's sunshine laws, and how to monitor HOA financials for irregularities. Rachel was a natural. She plotted Carol's activity on a timeline, overlaying it with when fines were issued, when city complaints were filed, and this was the disturbing part: her own work schedule. It was obvious Carol knew exactly when Rachel left and returned home. Frank's instincts paid off within 2 weeks. He connected us with Dr. Angela Kim, a family physician who had lived here 3 years ago. Angela's story was a near copy of Rachel's: bogus HOA fines, Anonymous complaints to the medical board, even the same community standards language in threatening letters. Angela had eventually sold her home at a loss just to get away. The key detail? Angela said Carol once bragged to her, in a moment of smugness, that she'd never lost a case. The more we dug, the uglier it got. HOA expenditure reports showed repeated payments to a company called Whitmore Community Services for emergency maintenance work that never happened. The amounts were always just under the threshold requiring board approval and always coincided with her harassment campaigns. Rachel stared at the spreadsheet one night, tracing the dates with her finger. "Jack," she said, her voice tightening, "she's not just harassing people. She's using HOA money to pay herself to do it." The thought that we were literally funding our own harassment lit a fire in me I didn't know I had. We weren't just fighting for our home or Rachel's career anymore. We were fighting to expose a predator who'd turned an entire neighborhood into her personal hunting ground. And we had just found our first real weapon. If there's one thing Carol never expected, it was that someone in her own neighborhood had been quietly building a case against her long before Rachel and I ever moved in. That someone was Frank Miller. Frank didn't look like a man who used to run undercover operations in the Bronx. He had the easy gait of someone who mowed his own lawn on Saturdays, the polite nod of a neighbor who might help you jump your car battery if it died. But behind those calm blue eyes was the watchfulness of a detective who'd spent 2 decades reading people's tells before they even opened their mouths. He came to us one evening just as the sun was slipping behind the rooftops, holding a manila folder under his arm. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. We sat around our kitchen table, the same one buried under violation slips and legal notices, while Frank flipped open the folder. Inside were neatly organized notes, photos, and printouts from public records. Dates, times, descriptions. "I've been watching her since last spring," Frank began. "She tried to fine me for a fence I never built. That's when I realized she wasn't just a busybody, she was running a pattern. I've seen people like this before. They escalate slowly, pick targets they think won't fight back, and then they push until those people either leave or break." Rachel leaned forward. "You think she's done this to others?" "I know she has," Frank said, sliding a photo across the table. It was a printout of Dr. Angela Kim's "For Sale" listing from 2 years ago. "Angela lived here before you. Family doctor. Korean American. Carol ran her through the exact same gauntlet she's putting you through now. HOA fines. City complaints. Anonymous tips to the medical board. Angela sold her place at a loss and moved across town." Hearing that was like looking into a mirror tilted just a few years back. Frank explained his method. He never confronted Carol directly. Instead, he documented. Security camera stills showing her photographing neighbors' cars. Copies of HOA meeting minutes where expenses to Whitmore Community Services were approved without question. Payment records obtained through public filings showing tens of thousands spent on emergency maintenance that never happened. Rachel's medical mind clicked instantly into gear. "Jack, look at these dates," she said, pointing to a column of payment records. "The biggest withdrawals all happen about 2 weeks before she starts harassing someone. It's like she's funding the campaign before it begins." Frank nodded. "Exactly. She uses the HOA as her personal bank account, then weaponizes the rules to drive people out. And here's the kicker, the company she's paying? It's hers." A cold, electric jolt went through me. We'd suspected she was stealing, but seeing it laid out in black and white was different. Frank leaned back in his chair. "If you want to beat someone like Carol, you don't just argue with her. You show the entire community the truth with evidence so solid they can't ignore it. That's how you take her down." For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since Rachel moved in. Hope. Not naive hope that Carol would suddenly stop, but the sharp-edged kind you get when you realize you've got a fighting chance. We made a pact that night. Frank would keep digging into financials and past victims. Rachel and I would continue documenting every encounter, every letter, every phone call. And together, we'd start quietly reaching out to other neighbors to see who else Carol had targeted. Before he left, Frank paused at the door. "One more thing," he said, lowering his voice. "When she figures out you're fighting back, she's going to escalate. Be ready. I've seen people like her get dangerous when they're cornered." Rachel met his gaze without flinching. Then we'll make sure we corner her for good. Once Frank showed us the paper trail, everything about Carol's behavior stopped looking random. It wasn't just harassment, it was a business model. And the more we dug, the more it looked like she'd been running it for years. The structure was disturbingly methodical. First, she identified her target. Always the same profile. Youngish couples, often with mixed heritage, successful in their careers, happy enough to make her resent them on sight. She'd start with surveillance, subtle at first, then constant. A clipboard at the window, a camera angled toward their driveway. Casual chats with other neighbors to collect gossip. Step 2 was the setup. She'd scour HOA bylaws until she found a rule vague enough to bend. Parking violations, mailbox height, yard aesthetics, trash can placement, anything she could twist into a fine. These early hits weren't about the money, they were about planting a seed. You're being watched. Step 3 was escalation. Once the target showed signs of frustration or pushback, she'd move to higher impact strikes. City code complaints about non-existent renovations, calls to employers hinting at misconduct, anonymous letters to licensing boards. This was when she began weaponizing bureaucracy, forcing her victims to spend time, money, and emotional energy defending themselves from thin air. And here's where it got truly twisted. Step 4. The funding. Frank's financial records showed that just before each harassment campaign, the HOA made emergency maintenance payments to Whitmore Community Services, Carol's shell company, always in amounts just under the $5,000 threshold requiring board approval. The services listed were things like storm damage repair, urgent landscaping, or security enhancement. Not one of them was real. That money, it became her war chest. She'd use it to cover legal filings, hire consultants who were really just friends willing to write letters against the targets, or, and this still makes my skin crawl, pay for minor property damage that she could later blame on the victims. Frank even found a receipt for industrial-strength adhesive, bought the same day a neighbor's mailbox was glued shut, forcing them to replace it at their own cost. Step 5 was the endgame. Most families folded before this point. They'd sell their house, move away, and eat the loss just to have peace again. But for those who resisted people like Rachel and me, Carol had a final move. Financial suffocation. She'd push the HOA to place liens for unpaid fines, freeze accounts through community banks, and drag them into court with fabricated disruption of neighborhood harmony claims. It was, in every sense, organized crime hiding in plain sight under the polite letterhead of the Westbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Rachel studied the timeline we'd built together, her finger tracing from one victim's harassment start date to the next. She's budgeting for it, she murmured. Every attack is planned, resourced, and executed like a military operation. She's not just angry, she's strategic, Frank added quietly. And she's careful to keep it just legal enough to make it hell to prosecute unless we can prove the money trail. Looking at that binder stuffed with color-coded tabs, it hit me we weren't dealing with a neighbor gone bitter. We were dealing with a predator who'd found a way to profit from her own cruelty. And every smiling wave she gave to passersby was just camouflage for the next family she'd bleed dry. That realization burned away whatever fear I had left. Then we take the money trail public, I said. We make it so the whole neighborhood sees exactly what she's been doing. Rachel looked up from the binder, her eyes hard. And we make sure we're her last target. We didn't know it yet, but the moment we decided to expose her, the rules of the game changed. Carol was about to realize that when you turn your neighborhood into a battlefield, sometimes your enemies learn how to fight back harder than you ever imagined. The moment we decided to take the money trail public, I knew Carol would feel the shift. It's like any predator, the instant they realize their prey isn't running anymore, they start circling with a different kind of hunger. At first, it was subtle. The curtains at her front window were drawn tighter than usual, but I'd still catch the glint of her glasses through a narrow slit. The clipboard disappeared, replaced by a small black notebook she kept tucked under her arm. She stopped smiling at passersby. In fact, she stopped waving altogether. Then the escalation began. One night, just after midnight, Rachel and I were woken by a sharp pop, pop, pop outside. We rushed to the window in time to see the faint glow of a lighter near Rachel's car. By the time I got outside, the lighter was gone, but the damage was done. Her tires had been slashed, all four, and a foul-smelling liquid had been poured across the hood. We called the police, but without a clear video of Carol doing it, all they could do was take a report. It was infuriating, but Frank pointed out something that made my skin crawl. She's testing your reaction time. She wants to see how fast you'll respond, how much you'll spend fixing it. It's psychological pressure. A week later, Rachel came home from a double shift looking pale. She told me Carol had been in the hospital parking lot, leaning against her yellow SUV just outside the property line. No clipboard, no notebook this time, just a phone in her hand, recording Rachel as she walked to her car. She didn't say a word, Rachel said, but I could feel it. She wants me to know she can be anywhere I am. It didn't stop there. We woke one morning to find our sprinkler system destroyed, the control box smashed open, water flooding into the basement. Frank checked a neighbor's doorbell cam, and there she was. Carol, at 2 in the morning, crouched by our water line with what looked like bolt cutters. Still, she was careful. Every act was just outside the boundaries of a chargeable crime, or at least, that's how she saw it. But the more desperate she got, the sloppier she became. Word about our investigation had started to leak. We hadn't told anyone directly, but a few neighbors noticed Frank coming and going, and whispers started spreading. People began avoiding Carol. The handful of allies she had left suddenly weren't seen on her porch anymore. That's when she turned to rumors. She started telling anyone who'd listen that Rachel was unstable and a danger to children. She implied that I was aggressive, even violent, and that we were trying to bring in undesirable elements to Westbrook Estates. It was a thin veil over something much uglier, the same coded language she'd used on every target before us. The breaking point for me came one Sunday morning when I saw her kneeling on the sidewalk, speaking to 2 neighborhood kids. They looked uncomfortable, glancing toward their own yard, but Carol kept talking, gesturing toward our house. When she saw me coming, she stood up fast and walked away without a word. I couldn't prove what she'd said, but the look on those kids' faces told me enough. She was trying to poison the well to make us pariahs in our own neighborhood. Frank didn't mince words when I told him. This is the phase where people like her make mistakes. She's unraveling, and that's when they get dangerous. Rachel's jaw tightened. Good. Let her make mistakes. Everyone is another piece of evidence. We'd set out to expose her corruption. Now, we were also racing against the clock because the closer we got to the truth, the more I was convinced Carol wasn't just going to ruin our lives. If we weren't careful, she might try to end them. By the time the first maple leaves started to turn, Rachel and I knew the showdown was coming. Carol's escalation had reached a fever-pitch: property damage, stalking, rumors, but so had our case against her. Every slip she made, every lie she told, was another nail in the coffin we were quietly building. Frank called it the final phase. She's isolated, paranoid, and she knows something's coming, he said over coffee one evening. That's exactly when you strike. But you have to do it clean, airtight evidence, undeniable witnesses, in the right setting. The right setting turned out to be a neighborhood safety forum. On paper, it was a harmless, quarterly HOA meeting about lighting improvements and traffic concerns. In reality, it would be the night we laid everything out in front of the entire community and in front of Carol. Preparation became our full-time life. Rachel and I worked late into the nights at the kitchen table, sorting documents into binders with clear labels. HOA, financial records, victim testimonies, property damage reports, anonymous complaints. Frank handled the tactical side, using his law enforcement contacts to quietly verify our evidence and make sure everything would stand if it went to court. We reached out to Dr. Angela Kim first. She didn't hesitate. "I'll fly back if I have to," she said. She can't keep doing this to people. Her willingness gave us momentum. Over the next 2 weeks, 4 more former residents agreed to share their stories, each one disturbingly similar to ours. Rachel also approached neighbors still living here who'd been quietly enduring Carol's harassment. Many were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation. But once they saw the growing coalition, they began to open up. One man described being fined for having the wrong shade of white on his garage door. Another woman had been accused of running an unlicensed daycare because her grandkids visited on weekends. The emotional weight of those conversations hit Rachel hardest. "She's not just cruel," she said one night, voice low. "She's stolen people's joy in their own homes. That's supposed to be sacred. Meanwhile, Frank coordinated with investigative reporter Kate Monroe from Channel 7. She'd been covering HOA corruption for years and knew exactly how to handle a story like this. She agreed to attend the meeting with a camera crew discreet at first, but ready to go live if things exploded. We kept the agenda under wraps. Only a tight circle knew the full plan. Rachel would speak first, calm and professional, detailing the harassment from a personal and medical perspective. Angela would follow, showing the pattern over time. Then Frank would deliver the knockout, punch the financial records, linking Whitmore Community Services to the HOA's missing funds. The night before the meeting, our living room looked like an operations center. Laptops open, printouts spread across every surface, a whiteboard covered in timelines and arrows. It wasn't lost on me that we were running this like an investigation team, and in a way, we were. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. Frank's warnings echoed in my mind. Cornered people can be unpredictable. And Carol wasn't just cornered. She was a woman whose entire identity was about to crumble in public. Before bed, Rachel came and stood beside me at the window, looking across at Carol's darkened house. Tomorrow, she said, we stop her. Her voice didn't shake. I took her hand, feeling the weight of everything we'd endured, everything we were risking. Tomorrow, I agreed. The air felt heavy, like the stillness before a summer storm. We both knew that when the clouds finally broke, there would be no going back. The night of the Neighborhood Safety Forum, Westbrook Estates Community Hall, had never been so full. Every seat was taken, people stood along the walls, and a low murmur of anticipation hummed through the air. You could feel it, the sense that something bigger than potholes or landscaping rules was about to go down. Carol arrived early, her yellow SUV pulling up like it owned the parking lot. She stepped out in a tailored navy suit, her clipboard clutched tight, and her lawyer, a tall man with a permanent scowl, trailing behind her. She scanned the room, clearly expecting to command it. But then her eyes landed on the Channel 7 camera crew setting up near the back. I saw her jaw tighten. When the meeting opened, the agenda looked harmless. Lighting updates, playground repairs. But as soon as community concerns was announced, I stood and took the microphone. Before we move forward, I said, my voice steady but carrying through the hall, there's something this community needs to see. Rachel stepped up beside me, her binder in hand. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the ICU nurse who'd been through worse nights than anyone here could imagine. Calm, measured, resolute. She began with facts, dates, times, violation notices, letters, and anonymous complaints. She showed how each incident lined up with her work schedule, proving the stalking. She spoke about the effect on her patients when she was pulled into unnecessary investigations, about coming home to slashed tires and a flooded basement. Her voice never wavered, but I saw neighbors shift uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at Carol. Then Angela Kim took the floor. She painted the bigger picture, her own harassment 2 years earlier, the identical tactics, the same language and letters. I left my home because of her, Angela said plainly, and I watched her start the same process on Rachel the moment she moved in. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carol's lawyer leaned over to whisper in her ear, but she brushed him off, staring straight ahead with that fixed, brittle smile. Then Frank took the mic. His voice carried the authority of a man who testified in courtrooms before. He laid out the financial records, the payments from the HOA to Whitmore Community Services, the non-existent repairs, the timing of those withdrawals just before harassment campaigns began. On the screen behind him, a slide appeared, a timeline showing 5 different families over 6 years, each one driven out after similar patterns of fines, complaints, and rumors. This isn't about community standards, Frank said, turning toward Carol. This is about one person using her position for personal profit and targeted harassment. And it stops tonight. The silence in the room was heavy. Then Carol stood, her voice rising. These people don't belong here. I have kept this neighborhood safe for years. You're all blind. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, but she pulled away, launching into a tirade about outsiders and keeping Westbrook the way it was meant to be. The words tumbled out faster, angrier, until even her few allies in the room were looking at the floor. And then, like it had been choreographed, Frank stepped aside and Detective Harris from the county sheriff's office walked in. He held a folded paper in his hand. Carol Whitmore, he said, his voice cutting clean through her rant. You're under arrest for theft, fraud, and criminal harassment. Gasps filled the room as he read her rights. Rachel handed over the thick envelope of evidence we'd compiled. The cameras caught everything: Carol's shock, the handcuffs clicking shut, the long walk past the very people she'd spent years intimidating. As the door closed behind her, the room erupted. Neighbors hugged, some cried. Others shook hands with Rachel and Angela, thanking them for finally ending it. For the first time since moving in, I felt like Westbrook Estates was truly our home. In the days after Carol's arrest, Westbrook Estates felt different, quieter, lighter. It was as if the neighborhood had been holding its breath for years and finally let it out. The fear that used to linger, the sense that eyes were always on you, had evaporated overnight. The county prosecutor moved quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the HOA financial records, victim testimonies, and footage from that night, Carol's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. She admitted to theft of community funds, fraud, and multiple counts of harassment. In exchange for avoiding a lengthy prison sentence, she accepted 12 months of house arrest with electronic monitoring, $38,000 in restitution to the HOA, $25, 0-inch damages split between Rachel and Angela, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA or similar authority position. The poetic part? Her 300 hours of community service would be served at a local immigrant resource center. Rachel didn't hide her smile when she heard that. Frank was unanimously elected the new HOA president at the next meeting. Angela joined the board, and Rachel accepted the role of community wellness coordinator, a volunteer position she used to organize events, mediate neighbor disputes, and keep the HOA focused on people instead of petty power plays. One of the first things they did was overhaul the bylaws to prevent another Carol. Every expense over $500 now required board and member approval. Financial statements had to be posted publicly every quarter. And a new anti-harassment policy gave residents the right to appeal directly to a committee of their peers instead of just the president. We decided to put Carol's restitution money to good use. $20,000 went into building a community garden in the empty lot behind the playground. Rachel threw herself into that project, sketching out spaces for vegetables, flowers, and a small seating area where neighbors could gather. The rest went into an emergency fund to help residents facing unexpected hardship, the exact opposite of the way Carol had used HOA funds. By spring, the garden was alive with color. Children ran between rows of marigolds and tomatoes, while parents chatted at picnic tables. There was no sense of who belonged and who didn't. People were just neighbors. Rachel's career, once under siege, didn't just recover, it thrived. The hospital formally cleared her of all accusations, and the state medical licensing board sent a written apology acknowledging how their system had been manipulated. She was promoted to charge nurse and later received a community service award from the mayor for her role in exposing corruption. The night she got that award, she stood in our kitchen holding the plaque and said, "You realize this all started with her calling the cops because I parked in my own driveway?" I laughed, but there was a tightness in my chest. "Yeah," I said. "She thought she could scare us. Instead, she gave us a reason to stand up." The neighborhood survey that summer showed 97% resident satisfaction, the highest in Westbrook's history. Property values rose by nearly 30%. 3 families who had left during Carol's reign moved back. And for 12 straight months, there wasn't a single harassment complaint. Carol's yellow SUV still sat in her driveway, but she didn't come out much anymore. The ankle monitor was a constant reminder of the walls closing in. Every so often, I'd catch her watching from the window as children played in the garden, as neighbors laughed together, a community she'd tried to fracture now thriving without her. She'd wanted control. She'd wanted to shape this neighborhood into her image. But in the end, she'd built something else entirely, a stronger, kinder Westbrook Estates. And standing there with Rachel, watching the garden she dreamed up come to life, I knew Carol had been right about one thing. Some people really do think the rules don't apply to them. She just never realized she was one of them. Looking back now, I realize Carol Whitmore never understood the most dangerous thing about trying to control people. Once they decide they've had enough, there's no putting them back in the box. When Rachel and I moved into Westbrook Estates, we thought we were just joining a nice suburban neighborhood. We never expected to be tested like this, to have our patience, our marriage, and our faith in fairness pushed to the edge. But Carol's campaign taught us something neither of us will ever forget. Bullies count on silence. They count on you being too embarrassed, too tired, or too scared to fight back. The truth is, the rules she used to justify her actions weren't the problem. Rules can protect a community when they're applied fairly. But in the wrong hands, they become weapons. And Carol was an expert at sharpening them. She believed she was the enforcer of standards, but what she really was a thief of peace. Standing in our garden now, watching neighbors plant marigolds next to tomatoes, I think about how close we came to giving in. How easy it would have been to just sell the house and walk away. That's what she wanted, not just from us, but from anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision. But we didn't walk away. And because of that, neither did the people who joined us. Frank, Angela, the neighbors who'd been silent for years, all of them found their voices when they saw that it was possible to win. We didn't just reclaim our home, we reclaimed our community. The most satisfying part isn't that Carol was arrested, or that she paid restitution, or even that she lost the position she clung to like a lifeline. It's that the hole she tried to dig for others became the pit she fell into herself. She wanted to isolate us. She ended up uniting us. She wanted to destroy reputations. She lost her own. She wanted to keep Westbrook Estates frozen in the past. She made it stronger, more diverse, and more welcoming than ever. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Never underestimate the power of good people who refuse to stay quiet. You don't have to be a detective, a lawyer, or a politician to stop abuse of power. You just have to be willing to stand up, keep receipts, and speak the truth where everyone can hear it. Rachel says something now whenever a new family moves in. She brings over a welcome basket, smiles, and says, "If anyone gives you trouble, you let us know. We protect each other here." That's the Westbrook Estates. I want to live in one where the rules are fair, the people are kinder, and no one ever has to feel like they don't belong in their own home. And if Carol is still watching from behind those curtains, I hope she sees it too. Not to gloat, but to understand. Because the day she finally understands why she lost, that will be the day she realizes we were never her enemies. We were simply her mirror.